All right, everyone, we have some more PlayStation 5 Pro breaking news. Kind of. And I say that because what happened recently, you might have seen this, is that we had a report come out yesterday from The Verge with the headline that PS5 Pro is real and developers are getting ready for it, which is a nice attention-grabbing headline. So this did get a lot of attention on X and also the PS5 subreddit. So if you did see this, then we can go over what happened here, which is the article is more or less them corroborating the same info we already knew about from the earlier reports from Tom Henderson writing for Insider Gaming, and also Moore's Law is Dead over on his YouTube channel, where he published actual documentation that's been shared around with developers, and that's kind of how this whole thing became what it is now, right? You know, developers have had PS5 Pro kits for quite a bit now if you're a first or second party, but recently a lot of third parties were finally given access to all this info, which means the floodgates opened. So I believe all three of these sources and anybody else have all been seeing the same documentation that developers now have, and it's just a matter of corroborating everything and making it more public. That's how this happened. So what we can say, though, is that there's just more evidence to it being real if you were not a believer at this point. Trust me, this thing actually is coming for sure. But the one little item we can mention here is that going back to the Moore's Law is Dead video, now it's been taken down at the request of Sony Interactive Entertainment. So if there was any sort of doubt that this thing was real, there you go. Again, we all knew it was coming at this point, but take it from somebody that has been covering PlayStation news for 12 years on this channel, publishing over 1,000 videos. Sony does not do that often. They rarely do that unless there is, you know, something going on here where, again, with Moore's Law is Dead, they actually published screenshots of the documentation that developers had. They did try to obfuscate it by, you know, putting watermarks on it, which is typical, and also them having the source credit, but yeah, SIE took that video down, confirmed, which, you know, what does that tell you? Either the info is real, or at the very least, you know, with plausible deniability, like the info is maybe outdated, but what we have right now is pretty much what this thing is going to be. It's completely locked in, and there was some items within the Verge report that sounded maybe like they were interpreting the info slightly differently from the other two sources we've had so far, which, and again, I've seen the documents, but I haven't like been able to like go through everything. I've only seen like little snippets here and there. So we're still kind of working off of breadcrumbs based on what's being shared from, you know, what is going to be a second, third hand source, things like that. So before we mention that, just very briefly, here's a quick recap for those that at least want to get caught up on what PlayStation 5 Pro is going to be. So here's the quick bullet points that you need to know. CPU, the current PS5 is still a Zen 2 CPU, 3.5 gigahertz, but PS5 Pro is going to increase that speed by basically 10%, like a clean 10%, now running at a capped frequency of 3.85 gigahertz, which for developers, what we're hearing is that there is a high CPU frequency mode that they can choose to utilize, where they can take advantage of that extra 10% at the expense of the GPU being downclocked by around 1.5%, resulting in what Sony calls is roughly 1% lower GPU performance. On the GPU side of things, this is where it's going to be a lot more interesting, because rendering is apparently 45% faster. There's 2 to 3 times ray tracing performance. We are also hearing that it's got BVH8 traversal shaders, so it's using AMD's RDNA 4 ray tracing hardware instead of the existing RDNA 2 BVH4 in the current PS5. That was also a point of contention, I know, for some when I had mentioned that in another PS5 Pro news discussion topic, is that, you know, hearing BVH8 shaders for RDNA 4 tech, that seems way too out there and something that PS5 Pro is not going to utilize. But, you know, this is kind of what we saw with PS5, the standard console, which is like this, I guess, this misnomer around, is it RDNA 1 or 2? Oh, it's got some RDNA 3 features. You know, Sony is a client. They're buying this stuff from AMD. So, I mean, really the thing's got RDNA features from, you know, a little bit everywhere, right? Sony is a customer. They can choose and pick the sort of, you know, GPU features that they want for their hardware. So that's the same case here, right? We're hearing that PS5 Pro is going to have this one particular portion of next generation RDNA 4 tech, which is believable. That's what they can do, right? They can get that sort of insight, and they can get that early in as they're buying into that, and AMD can, you know, of course, they're working with economy of scale, right? They're going to be able to produce that stuff in mass for Sony and all the consoles that they're planning on selling. But the point is, we are hearing that for the GPU side of things. But anyway, we're also hearing that Sony's new in-house solution for the ML AI enhancements is called PSSR, PlayStation Spectral Super Resolution. Also, we're hearing that it's got 30 workgroup processors, so that should be about 60 CUs versus the standard PS5's 18 workgroup processors, so there's probably like 4 disabled there for yield, so it's like actually 56 CUs that are being used. Memory, current PS5 has 16 gigabytes of GDDR6 at 448 gigabytes of bandwidth. PS5 Pro should be, again, the same 16 gigabytes of GDDR6, but running at a slightly higher frequency, 16 gigabits per second, so the memory bandwidth should be 576 gigabytes. The recent new info that we learned is that Sony is also freeing up more memory to developers on PS5 Pro, so there's going to be an additional 1.2 gigs, which means the usable memory is 13.7 now for developers on PS5 Pro versus 12.5 on the standard PS5. Again, there's some audio enhancements there. The ACV runs at a higher clock speed, resulting in the ACM library having 35% more performance. More convolution reverbs can now be processed. More FFT or IFFT can be processed. It's also understood that as a means to make PS5 Pro more competitive, which is not my phrasing, but they want it to offer a detachable disk drive, which would be identical to the latest iteration of the standard PS5, and 1 terabyte of storage. And the SDK is on version 9 right now, and 10.0 is expected in fall of this year. So with the Verge report, there's the same info, right? They're corroborating all this stuff, but the few lines in there that stuck out to me as maybe them interpreting it slightly different to where it sounds like it's new info is that developers are being asked to ensure their games are compatible with the upcoming console with a focus on ray tracing, as in maybe Sony is spending more time creating a dialogue with developers that, hey, maybe you should focus more on adding ray tracing ray tracing features to this particular game. And it doesn't sound like it's a mandate. I would be shocked otherwise if, there was this sort of mandate, hey, you have to have, rather, you can ship a game without PS5 Pro enhancements, but just, now when you start submitting these games for certification, you can start benchmarking the compatibility on PS5 Pro just to make sure the game works. I would imagine that's kind of what's being interpreted here, because again, I don't think there's a mandate that studios have to offer PS5 Pro enhancements, just that they could, because the benefit there is that if they do, then they can get the Trinity Enhanced label, Trinity being the code name, but we presume that's going to be a PS5 Pro label, PS5 Pro Enhanced label. So the other item in there that sounds new is that if developers want that label, they will have to, quote, provide significant enhancements, which, with PS4 Pro, my understanding was always that they didn't really have to do too much to get that label. Again, if they can just sort of make that case with like a development partner or their partner manager that, hey, we're doing X, Y, and Z things that maybe in the grand scheme of things, one would argue that's not a huge boost. But typically it's like they only have to do a few things to get that sort of label. But in this case, maybe Sony will be a bit more stringent on what's going to get that label. I don't know. That's at least what kind of language is being used here. But they do say that Sony is expecting every game submitted to certification in August is going to be compatible with PS5 Pros, and that's maybe the deadline for having a game show up day one for PS5 Pro availability. So at least if you want to be able to, if you're a studio right now developing games and you want to be there day one for PS5 Pro, that seems like the cutoff for certification. Obviously, that's something where it's just a cutoff for day one. So at that point, it's fair game. We'll see. Hopefully, plenty of games support PS5 Pro enhancements, and also maybe studios going back to their older games and offering PS5 Pro enhancements with patches. Which that was maybe the most notable story we had recently about PS5 Pro is that it's understood that this is not going to be the same scenario that PS4 and PS4 Pro saw, where if a studio wanted to update a game with PS4 Pro enhancements, they would have to bring it up to the most recent SDK, which for some games made on PS4, around between 2013 when the console came out to, let's say, up to 2016, well, the closer you get, the easier it might be for a studio in terms of, time investment, the resource management to update that particular game and that build to the most recent SDK. But that's kind of why, like for PS4 Pro, a lot of early PS4 games never saw PlayStation 4 Pro enhancements. You know, some studios, they ship a game and that they just kind of leave it as it is, right? Years go by, if there is new hardware that's introduced, which was very new for that previous console cycle, that's just why we saw a lot of early lifecycle PS4 games never get touched. But what we're hearing about for PlayStation 5 Pro is that there's maybe that barrier isn't there, at least for potentially incorporating PSSR, PlayStation Spectral Super Resolution. So we could see early gen PS5 native games that don't have to be on the most recent SDK to utilize that feature, which would be really cool and exciting. But there's still obviously the case too where we can get more recent PS5 titles that get like true proper patches that also incorporate more heavy use into the GPU side of things and having the ray tracing support or adding ray tracing to games that didn't have it. I mean, there's some very obvious suspects we could see, and when Sony eventually does talk about this machine, and when we around the time we expect, which would be like, let's say September to ship it in November, if we're following the same formula of PS4 Pro, then they'll debut a bunch of like, you know, first party games. So I'm sure like Spider-Man, I feel like is almost obvious. We'll see Spider-Man 2 there with some enhancements, maybe Gran Turismo or God of War Ragnarok. Returnal would be super cool, right? Because that game actually runs at a, well, the base frame rate is like 1080p basically, and they upscale from there. So Returnal could see a lot of benefits, and then like also proper ray tracing support added to that game, since they're using the RT hardware to just accelerate certain things. Their global illumination on the software side, I believe. I think that's what's going on with the console version of Returnal. So there's a lot of benefits that could be made there. So point being, like first party, you're going to see a lot of that debut initially. But that's kind of where we're at for PS5 Pro right now. So again, not really new info, but hey, at least you're kind of caught up on what's going on right now. But with all that said, I'll see you this coming Friday for more news in the PlayStation landscape on Let's Talk PlayStation, and I'm still working on 2 other things that are just taking a very long time, so for now that's all. We'll only have like this discussion video on this Tuesday upload, but that's pretty much it. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you all in my next video. You take it easy.